All right. In today's lab lecture, I want to sort of wrap up the previous discussion we had on annealing of cartridge rest. So I just want to kind of go over a couple things that tend to show up in the micrographs that you're starting to get. All right, so I showed this one last time in the context of what stages are we looking at? And we saw that this was during recrystallization because we see some of these clusters of new grains, but we still see the rolling direction that's going horizontal on our screen, right? But the main thing I want you to sort of take away from this image is where these crystals, these newly recrystallized grains are forming. You see that there's some patterns, right? They are forming in distinct regions. It is not completely random where they occur, right? So just kind of take a look at where these clusters are tend to form and kind of the directionality of that. Same thing, if you zoom in, you see that and a lot more, right? So that brings us to what are these features, right? So I just wanted a little bit clearer image for you. So I put this one up. This is the one that you'll find in Callister, chapter 8, as you can see down here. This is a cold worked grain before recrystallization forms. But you see that these lines here are present in the microstructure. This is not an artifact of scratching, and I can tell that because these lines, if they were scratches on your microstructure, they would go outside the grain, right? It would go all across the image, right? So it's basically statistically unlikely or impossible that a scratch would only affect one grain, right? And then end at those grains. So these are something else, right? But the reason I bring this up and I ask what these features are is because if you look at the recrystallization, and if you go back to the image that I just showed for our materials, these new grains that you can see here form from or on those features, right? You can see the clear linear nature of these new crystals, and they're forming on these features. And so that's important, right? And we need to know what these are because there does seem to be some preference for these features. And so that's what we want to look at. So these are where these crystallized grains tend to grow. They can grow other places, but definitely you see predominantly growing on these lines. All right, so yeah, that's what you should be asking yourself is what are these? We see these in our microstructures from the images I've already put up on the course Google Drive. You can see that we also have versions of these lines in the grains that are not scratches. There are some scratches in the images, but this is not the same. Also, we still see these features too, and you can kind of see a distinct difference in the width here of these features, right? And so you should also think about what those features are. So take a minute and think about that, but I'm gonna, in the next slide, go over and show you what these two features are. All right, so this is what these two features are. So if we think about dislocations move on slip planes, right? And so if we have a tensile bar here and we apply a tensile load, that results in a shear stress moving in this direction and this direction, and they move on the slip bands that are the lowest energy slip bands, right? And so that's these bands. So with light microscopy, we can't see a single dislocation, right? A single dislocation is on the order of the atomic spacing, and so we're not going to see that on light microscope. But what does happen is that these slip will occur on certain bands and cause the shifting of a certain subsection of the crystal, right? Like this. And so you'll see this sort of step feature in this. And so these are the slip planes that are being active. So it's not a single dislocation, it's basically cooperative motion of many dislocations that we see. So what we're seeing there, those lines, they're all, at sort of roughly 45-degree angle, right, where the shear stress is maximized, those are what we call slip bands. So if we go back here, these lines, these cross, you notice that it's cross-hatched too at roughly 45 degrees. That is slip bands. That's what we're seeing here. We're not seeing an individual. I can't say that one line is a slip band, but is the cooperative motion of many planes into a band. And so that's why they're all parallel, and that's why they end at the grain, right? Because if you go to another grain, the orientation changes, and therefore those will change. And so you can see that in some of these images, is that the orientation is slightly different. So that's what these narrow lines are, these hash marks that basically that we see in our images. And we see these in our microstructures as well. The larger bands here, these really thick black lines in this case, again, are parallel. In this case, they're still parallel to the slip bands, but in this case, they're much wider, right? And that's because of twins, right? So this twinning process can occur from mechanical forces. It can also occur from annealing, but these are when you change the orientation of a subsection, the twin, and then it goes back to normal. And so the contrast on this, because of the etching rate or the way that it scatters light, is different, and that's why you see the difference in contrast here, because it's etching rate and the fact that a different plane is exposed, right? And so that's a thick band when it's what we call annealing twins. So these are, so basically if we start to think and we look at when we see these, right? So slip bands are going to occur when we have that mechanical deformation from rolling, right? So after rolling, we tend to see these, right? And we tend to see them until something overtakes them. And so we'll see all of these slip bands in unannealed samples that are rolled, and then we'll see them in annealed samples if we haven't consumed that structure. So that's when we tend to see these. So these are along with the rolled grains. Twins here, there's two types of twins, but the ones that we tend to see are called annealing twins. And so we see these twins in grains that are unannealed. So in an unannealed sample, you're going to see that grain structure here. And usually during the rolling process, this gets kind of rid of them unless we're on the lower side, which is the case here. We tend to see these will kind of disappear eventually during rolling. It'll be harder to see. But annealed, you tend to see them. And also, after you recrystallize grains and they continue to grow, we will also see them. So we tend to see these in unannealed samples, but also samples that have been annealed a long time. So you'll see these twins, and they're representative of the thick region that we see in the microstructure. So that's kind of answering this question. And I just threw this in here. This is actually a ceramic material, but there are another type of twins. So this lens shape defect inside this grain is also a twin, but this is a mechanical twin. They tend to be representative of thinner and more lens shaped, and so that can be caused by the mechanical properties when you roll something. But in cartridge brass, we don't tend to see these types. We tend to see the very broad, thick ones that I showed you in the previous images, like this. So I just wanted to throw that out here. I don't expect to see many of these, but that's a mechanical twin. So you can kind of see the difference here. So mechanical twin, annealing twin. So it's really a thickness issue in that case. But in both cases, it only goes to the length of the grain. So when you're looking at your micrographs, pay attention to whether it's a scratch or not based on whether it truncates at the grain boundary. All right, so that's just the last couple things I wanted to mention on annealing, because you're going to start to get these micrographs, and I want you to sort of understand these features and where new grains come from and where they nucleate. All right, this video is going to talk about experimental procedures. So you have an upcoming assignment on writing the experimental procedures for this brass lab. And so I want you to, and I'm just going to go in a little bit more detail here on what we're looking for and what should be in an experimental procedures section. And I'm going to do this by looking at an example system, an example procedure section. We're going to take a look at the section. So the first thing, and I kind of asked this as a hypothetical question, but I want you to think about what you think should go into an experimental procedures section, and then I'll give sort of my list, but also just think, use your own judgment and see what you think should be in here. So, and I've put this in the guidelines document and in the write-up for this lab assignment, but the things that I think should be in there, and some of the things that I'll be grading you on, is the procedure that we're going to look at here in a second. Does it give adequate description of the equipment used in the experiment? All right, so the one that I have for you is taken from a real research article, and this is a snippet of the experimental procedure section from that. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because I wanted to show you what that can look like, right? So in this case, they're talking about different resistance and Raman spectra, and they tell you it's measured by this technique, right? That's the method, and that can also be the equipment that's used, and they tell you the currents used, all that, and they're mentioning the specific equipment measurement, what the measurements were taken with. So they give you this acronym, but they also describe it. So this is a piece of equipment. Same thing down here. They have magnetic susceptibility measurements, and they're performed by this system, and they give you what it is and who makes it. So make and model. That's what I'm always asking for that. And so that's a good, example of equipment description, right? So in your lab, think about what equipment that we used. Again, you're not in the lab every day, but think about the equipment that I've showed you that we use and what it's called, who makes it, from what, right? And so most cases, especially the big pieces of equipment, you want to give as much information as possible. If it's smaller stuff like calipers that tend to get used in everything, then there's obviously some leniency in that, because there's just a generic plethora of different calipers that you can use that give you more or less the same results. So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about equipment description. Descriptions of what you're using to run the experiment. So you only really have to talk about the stuff that is in the paper. That's the other focus of this. All right. Next thing I'm looking for is, well, there was equipment, so now also materials that are used, right? So I want to know what materials we use. This is a materials lab. There's obviously going to be some materials. So again, I highlighted a section from that experimental procedure. And so it talks about a metal gasket, and it tells you what the alloy is. It tells you the thickness. It tells you the pressure that it's used. It tells you, a lot of information. I will say that this paper is about a sort of novel experimental procedure, and so they tend to give a lot more detail about the equipment, because they're kind of making a piece of equipment that they're going to use. So they're doing this. They also talk about an insulating layer, and they say that it can be made of a range of things. So it doesn't necessarily have to be one material. It could be a range of materials as well. So that's another thing. So materials you used. So obviously we're talking about cartridge brass. That better be there, but give me more description of what you're using, right? You want to be a little bit more specific, and you want to be as specific as possible. All right. Next, what else I'm looking for? This is the procedure, right? I want a description of the procedure. So this is where we can get into differences in what goes into a procedure and what goes into other types of documents, like an operation manual, right? Here, I don't need to know that you clicked a button on your PC. So that level of detail is not important. But I do need to know the critical things that another researcher would need to know in order to run the same experiment, right? So they already know what equipment's used, what materials are used. Now they need to know, pressures, temperatures, thicknesses, operating conditions, right? And how you did it. right? And so this case, I highlighted a huge section because, again, this is a novel experimental procedure, and so they really highlight a lot of details on how to do it, and they have diagrams too, so that can be done as well. A lot of times in our labs, you don't necessarily need to have a lot of diagrams for the experimental procedures, but one case, if you can think about it, for example, metallography, what face we're observing, that could be useful. That might be a schematic that you want to put on your figure. So that could be part of it. But they give a lot of results here about the procedures. So, they're giving you pressures here, thicknesses, what materials are used, how the whole thing is done, right? They give a lot of information on everything, temperatures and so forth. So they really give you a lot of details, and that's what we're looking for. So whether it's annealing, whether it's rolling, whether it's using the conductivity meter, we need to know all the conditions, right? How was it done? But again, you don't have to tell people how to do it. You're not trying to educate them, and they're not going to get trained from your procedure section on how to actually operate it. This is just so that they know all the conditions to do the same experiment. All right, and one last thing that we'll often be looking for is the justification for your choices. And so this is important to not only sometimes say what you did, but why did you choose that, right? So this is a good example from this procedure. So I draw your attention back to the insulating layer that they talked about using, right? Well, you might ask yourself why they chose what they did. So they have an insulating layer, and it's made of one of those three materials. But they also say that the reason they chose these three materials is that they do not react with hydrogen sulfide, right? H2S. So that's the important part about this insulating layer. So that would say that you can choose any of these materials. Also, though, if you can think of something else that's both insulating and doesn't react with H2S, then you could use that, right? So that's the importance of this sort of justification. So if I have to make an alteration, is it going to affect the experiment? So, and then they have multiple examples here, right? So the layer they talked about has a thickness of this, and the reason it has that thickness is it provides stable clamping. So that's what I'm talking about justification. Justification doesn't mean you're writing 2 to 3 paragraphs on, convincing people. It just means that you tell people why you did something. And so it's very short. You can see to provide stable clamping. That's the justification. As the materials do not react with H2S. That is the justification. So really short little justifications. That's what we're looking for.